I remember the exact moment I chose to ignore it. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. Just a quiet sentence from someone I barely knew, that somehow stayed with me longer than it should have. Not everything is as simple as it looks. At the time, I smiled, nodded, and moved on. I wish I hadn't. Back then, my life felt predictable. Not perfect, but stable in a way I had learned to rely on. I worked at a mid-sized logistics company in Chicago. Nothing glamorous, just spreadsheets, calls, and deadlines. My days were structured, my routines consistent. Wake up at 7, coffee from the same place on 3rd Street, sit at the same desk, talk to the same people. There's comfort in repetition. It gives you the illusion that things are under control. I used to believe that if something looked fine on the surface, it probably was. That belief made life easier. It meant I didn't have to question much, or anyone. Especially people. One of those people was Daniel. He joined our team a few months before everything changed. Quiet guy. Early 30s, maybe. Always on time, always polite, always distant. Not unfriendly. Just reserved. I remember thinking he was the kind of person who preferred staying invisible. Which, in a workplace like ours, wasn't unusual. At first, we barely spoke. Just small, practical exchanges. Hey, can you send me that file? Yeah, give me a second. Thanks. That was it. But over time, I started noticing small things. Nothing big. Nothing obvious. Just little inconsistencies. Like how he'd hesitate before answering simple questions. Or how he'd double-check things that didn't really need checking. Once, I caught him staring at his screen long after everyone else had left. Not working. Just staring. I remember thinking it was strange. But not strange enough to matter. At least, that's what I told myself. The warning came from someone unexpected. Her name was Lisa. She worked in HR. We'd talked a few times, nothing serious, just casual conversations in the break room. One afternoon, we ended up grabbing coffee at the same time. She looked at me for a second and said, "You work closely with Daniel, right?" I shrugged. Sort of. Why? She hesitated. That should have been my first clue. Then she said it. Just, be careful with assumptions. Not everything is as simple as it looks. I laughed a little. That sounds vague. Maybe, she said. But I mean it. And that was it. No explanation. No context. Just a sentence, and a look I didn't fully understand. I remember walking back to my desk thinking she was overreacting. Or maybe just being overly cautious. HR people tend to be like that. So I did what most people do when something doesn't immediately make sense. I ignored it. A few weeks passed. Everything stayed the same. Or at least, it looked like it did. But that sentence started creeping back into my thoughts. Usually at quiet moments. When I noticed Daniel avoiding eye contact. Or when he'd leave conversations halfway through, like something suddenly pulled his attention elsewhere. Or when I'd catch that same blank stare at his screen. It wasn't enough to alarm me. But it was enough to make me curious. Still, I didn't ask. Because asking meant acknowledging that something might actually be wrong. And I wasn't ready for that. The turning point came on a Thursday. It was late. Most people had already left. I stayed behind to finish a report. Daniel was still there too. We didn't talk much, but that night felt different. Quieter than usual. At some point, I heard something. Not loud. Just a chair moving suddenly. I looked up. Daniel was standing, staring at his desk. His hands were slightly shaking. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to ignore it. Go back to my screen. Pretend I didn't notice. That would have been easier. Safer. But something about the way he stood there made that impossible. So I asked, "Hey, you okay?" He didn't answer immediately. Just kept staring. Then, without looking at me, he said, "Do you ever feel like people don't really see you?" It caught me off guard. I wasn't expecting that. "I mean, sometimes," I said carefully. He nodded slowly. "They think they know you. Based on how you act. How you look. But they don't." There was something in his voice. Not anger. Not sadness. Just exhaustion. I didn't know what to say. So I said nothing. After a few seconds, he sat back down and continued working like nothing happened. And I did the same. But something had shifted. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. About what Lisa said. About what Daniel said. About how easily I had dismissed both. I started replaying every interaction I'd had with him. Looking for meaning in things I had ignored before. And slowly, something uncomfortable started forming. A realization. Maybe I didn't understand him at all. Maybe I hadn't even tried. The next day, I made a decision. A small one. But it changed everything. Instead of keeping things surface level, I decided to actually pay attention. Not just to what people said, but to how they said it. To pauses. To silence. To what wasn't being said. It sounds simple. But it's not something most of us do. We assume. We label. We move on. I had been doing that for years. Over the next few days, I noticed more. Daniel wasn't just quiet. He was careful. Careful with his words. Careful with his reactions. Careful with how much he revealed. Like someone who had learned, at some point, that being fully seen wasn't safe. That realization stayed with me. And it made me feel uneasy. Because it wasn't about him anymore. It was about how many people I had probably misunderstood in the same way. A week later, I finally asked him something real. We were alone again. I said, "That thing you said the other night, about people not really seeing you, what did you mean?" He looked at me for a long time. Like he was deciding whether I was worth answering. Then he said, quietly, "People see what's easy. Not what's true." I didn't interrupt. He continued. "I've spent most of my life trying to fit into what people expect. Acting normal. Saying the right things. Smiling when I should." He paused. "But that's not the same as being understood." There it was. Simple. Honest. Uncomfortable. And suddenly, everything made sense. Not in a dramatic way. Just, quietly. The consequences of that moment weren't immediate. Nothing exploded. Nothing visibly changed. But inside me, something shifted. I started questioning my own behavior. How often had I chosen convenience over understanding? How often had I labeled someone as quiet, weird, or difficult, just because I didn't take the time to look deeper? It wasn't a good feeling. But it was an honest one. Over time, Daniel and I talked more. Not about anything dramatic. Just real things. Life. Pressure. Expectations. And slowly, I realized something I hadn't noticed before. He wasn't distant. He was guarded. There's a difference. And it matters. That one warning, "Not everything is as simple as it looks," kept echoing in my mind. Because it wasn't just about Daniel. It was about people in general. About how quickly we build perceptions, and how rarely we question them. About how much we miss, simply because we're not looking. The real lesson didn't come as a sudden realization. It came slowly. In small moments. In conversations I used to avoid. In pauses I used to fill. In people I started seeing differently. Looking back now, I realize something uncomfortable. If I had continued ignoring that warning, nothing would have seemed wrong. Everything would have stayed normal. But I would have stayed the same. And sometimes, that's the real cost. Not what happens, but what never changes. Now, whenever I meet someone new, or even interact with someone I already know, I remind myself of one thing. What I see is only a small part of the truth. And what I assume is often the biggest barrier to understanding. So here's what I still think about, even now. How many people have we misunderstood? Just because we never looked beyond what was easy to see?